The rain had been falling since dawn, not hard but steady, the kind that soaks through your shoes before you even notice. Outside the county courthouse, people hurried under umbrellas, collars turned up, eyes fixed on the slick pavement. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood, coffee, and the sharp tang of nervous sweat. It was just another Tuesday in a building that had seen thousands of Tuesdays, each one filled with small dramas, quiet heartbreaks, and the occasional spark of something unexpected. Near the back of courtroom 3, an older black woman sat alone on a wooden bench. She wore a navy blue coat that had clearly seen better days, its elbows slightly frayed, its buttons mismatched, but it was clean, pressed, and worn with a kind of quiet dignity. Her gray hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her hands, resting gently in her lap, were lined with age but steady. She carried a leather satchel, its surface cracked from years of use, the kind that had probably held everything from legal briefs to grocery lists to birthday cards for grandchildren. She didn't fidget. She didn't glance around anxiously like so many others did on their first or 50th day in court. She simply waited, eyes forward, as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. And in a way, she had. The courtroom buzzed with the usual pre-session murmur, lawyers whispering strategy, clerks shuffling papers, defendants nervously tapping their feet. A young man in a too-tight suit kept checking his phone, clearly hoping for a text that would magically cancel his hearing. An elderly couple clutched hands, their faces drawn with worry over a property dispute that had dragged on for months. No one paid much attention to the woman in the back. She didn't look like a lawyer, no crisp blazer, no designer briefcase, no assistant trailing behind her with a tablet. She looked like someone's grandmother who'd come to support a family member, maybe to sit through a boring hearing out of love or obligation. Then the bailiff called her name. "Evelyn Thorne," he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. She rose slowly, not because of frailty, but with the deliberate grace of someone who knows that haste rarely serves justice. As she walked toward the front, a few heads turned, not out of recognition, but curiosity. Who was she? Was she representing herself? That was always a risky move in civil court, especially in a case involving property liens, which could get tangled in technicalities even seasoned attorneys struggled with. At the counsel table, she placed her satchel down and opened it just enough to pull out a manila folder. She laid it flat, smoothed the edges with her palm, and stood quietly, waiting for the judge to acknowledge her. Judge Harold Wexler entered a moment later, his black robe swishing as he took his seat on the bench. He was in his late 50s with sharp features and a reputation for efficiency. Some called it impatience. He'd been on the bench for 12 years, and in that time he'd developed a habit of cutting through what he saw as unnecessary theatrics. He preferred facts, not feelings, procedure, not pleas, and he had little tolerance for people who showed up unprepared, especially those who tried to play lawyer without the license to back it up. He glanced at the docket. "Thorne versus Crestline Holdings," he read aloud, then looked up. His eyes landed on the woman standing at the plaintiff's table. He frowned slightly. "Are you Miss Thorne?" "I am, Your Honor," she replied, her voice calm, clear, and carrying just enough weight to fill the room without raising its volume. "And you're representing yourself today?" he asked, already flipping through the file, his tone edged with the kind of weary skepticism that comes from seeing too many well-meaning but outmatched individuals try to navigate legal waters alone. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she met his gaze evenly. There was no anger in her eyes, no defensiveness, just a quiet steadiness that seemed to say, "I've been here before." "I know how this goes. I'm appearing on behalf of Mr. Leonard Briggs," she said finally. "He's the homeowner in question. I'm his legal counsel." The judge paused. He looked up from the file, eyebrows lifting just a fraction. "Counsel?" he repeated as if testing the word. "You're an attorney?" There was a beat of silence. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but in a courtroom 2 seconds can feel like an eternity. The clerk stopped typing. The young man in the too-tight suit looked up from his phone. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. "Yes, Your Honor," she said simply. Judge Wexler leaned back slightly, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to something closer to disbelief. He scanned the file again as if her name might suddenly appear alongside a bar number or firm affiliation. It didn't. The paperwork listed her as representing party, but gave no details about her credentials. In his mind, that confirmed it. She was one of those well-intentioned neighbors or church friends who thought they could step in and help out without understanding the rules. He sighed, just audibly enough to carry. "Ma'am," he said, his voice tinged with condescension, "if you're not a licensed attorney, you really shouldn't be arguing legal points in my courtroom. This isn't a community meeting. There are procedures, rules, and frankly, it's not fair to your friend if you're not qualified to represent him." A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. One woman glanced at her companion with a look that said, "Did he really just say that?" The bailiff stared straight ahead, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The woman, Evelyn, didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she reached into her satchel again, this time pulling out a small laminated card. It was old, the edges slightly curled, the photo faded, but the gold seal in the corner still gleamed under the courtroom lights. She placed it gently on the table, right at the edge where the judge could see it clearly. "State Bar of Jefferson County," it read. "Evelyn Thorne, attorney at law, license number 1842. Judge Wexler's eyes flicked from the card to her face, then back to the card. His expression changed. First confusion, then dawning recognition, then something that looked uncomfortably like embarrassment. He hadn't recognized the name at first. But now, as he stared at that number, 1842, he realized something. That wasn't just any bar number. That was one of the earliest issued to a woman in the state, and certainly one of the first given to a black woman. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He sat up straighter. The condescension drained from his face, replaced by something far more human. Uncertainty. I wasn't aware you were practicing," he said, his voice quieter now, less assured. "I'm not regularly," she replied. "But Mr. Briggs is a neighbor. A veteran. He's been living in that house for 32 years. Last month, a company he's never heard of sent him a notice saying he owed $47,000 in back taxes, or they'd seize the property. He came to me because he didn't know who else to trust." She said it without drama, without accusation, just facts. But those facts hung in the air like smoke, visible, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. The judge cleared his throat. "I see," he said, though it was clear he didn't, not fully, not yet. He glanced at the opposing counsel, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who worked for a firm known for aggressive property acquisitions. That man suddenly looked less confident, his polished smile faltering under the weight of the moment. Evelyn didn't press the issue. She didn't gloat. She simply stepped back, giving the judge space to recalibrate. But the room had already changed. The energy had shifted. What had begun as a routine hearing, another forgettable case in a long line of them, now felt charged with something. Deeper. History. Respect. The quiet power of someone who didn't need to announce her presence, because her presence announced itself. Outside, the rain continued to fall. But inside courtroom 3, something had cracked open. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to let in a little light. And Evelyn Thorne, standing there in her worn coat with her old satchel at her feet, knew this wasn't just about a lien or a property deed. It was about who gets to speak, who gets heard, and who gets dismissed before they've even said a word. She'd spent her life fighting that kind of dismissal, not with shouts but with preparation. Not with anger, but with unwavering belief in the system, even when the system forgot her. Now, it was time to remind it. The silence that followed wasn't the kind that feels empty. It was thick, charged like the air before a storm breaks. Judge Wexler stared at the bar card on the table as if it might suddenly explain itself. License number 1842. He'd seen that number before, years ago, in a legal history seminar during law school. It belonged to one of the first black women admitted to the state bar, a name that came up in discussions about civil rights litigation and landmark housing cases. He'd assumed she was long retired or worse, gone. Yet here she stood, calm as morning light, in a courtroom he thought he controlled. He cleared his throat again, this time more deliberately. "Ms. Thorne," he began, his voice softer now, stripped of its earlier edge. I apologize. I didn't realize." She gave a small nod. Not to accept the apology so much as to acknowledge it existed. "No harm done, Your Honor," she said. "Let's proceed with the matter at hand." But the room hadn't reset. Something had shifted in the bones of the place. The young public defender near the front row sat up straighter, eyes wide with recognition. She'd read about Evelyn Thorne in law school, how she'd taken on redlining cases in the 70s when banks refused to lend to black families in certain neighborhoods, how she'd argued before the state Supreme Court at a time when women, especially black women, were rarely seen in appellate courtrooms, let alone winning. The court reporter, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and decades of transcripts under her belt, paused mid-stroke, then slowly lowered her steno machine onto her lap. She remembered. She'd been a clerk back then, watching from the gallery as Evelyn dismantled a discriminatory zoning law with nothing but precedent. Logic and quiet resolve. Even the opposing counsel, polished, confident, used to steamrolling pro-se litigants or underfunded advocates, now shifted in his seat. He'd come prepared to dismiss this as a nuisance case, another elderly homeowner too confused to fight back. But this wasn't confusion. This was precision wrapped in humility. Evelyn opened her manila folder and laid out 3 documents in neat alignment. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit A, the original deed to the property at 1427 Maple Street, recorded in 1989. Exhibit B, 32 years of uninterrupted tax payments, verified by county records. And Exhibit C, the notice sent to Mr. Briggs last month by Crestline Holdings, claiming a lien based on unpaid municipal assessments that don't appear in any public ledger. Her voice remained even, but each word landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to impress. She was simply laying out the truth, piece by piece, as if building a bridge across a river of lies. Judge Wexler nodded slowly. Counsel for the defense, do you have a response to these exhibits? The opposing attorney stood, adjusting his cufflinks with slightly unsteady hands. Your Honor, Crestline Holdings acquired the debt portfolio from a third-party collector, and were acting in good faith based on the documentation provided to us. Good faith? Evelyn interrupted gently, not sharply, but with a question that carried weight. When your client sent a demand letter threatening seizure of a home owned by a disabled veteran, without verifying the existence of the debt with the county treasurer's office, the attorney opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced at his notes, then at his client's file, then back at Evelyn. There was no rehearsed answer for this. Because the truth was, they hadn't verified. They'd bought a bundle of debts cheap, sent out mass notices, and hoped enough people would pay out of fear to make it profitable. It was a common tactic, legal in the grayest of areas, but rarely challenged by someone who knew exactly how to expose its flimsiness. Judge Wexler's expression darkened. He'd seen this scheme before. Predatory firms snapping up old, often inaccurate debt records and using the threat of legal action to squeeze money from vulnerable people. But usually those people didn't have someone like Evelyn Thorne in their corner. Ms. Thorne, the judge said carefully, you mentioned Mr. Briggs as a veteran. Is he present today? He's outside, Your Honor, she replied. He uses a walker, and the courthouse elevator has been out of service for 2 weeks. He didn't want to cause a scene, so he waited in his car. A murmur ran through the gallery. Someone muttered, "That's disgraceful." The judge's jaw tightened. "Bailiff," he said, "please have Mr. Briggs brought in. Use the service entrance if you have to. And someone get maintenance on that elevator. Today." As the bailiff hurried out, Evelyn remained standing, her hands resting lightly on the table. She didn't look triumphant. If anything, she looked tired, not from age, but from the weight of knowing how often this kind of thing happened. How many people suffered in silence because they didn't know their rights or didn't believe anyone would listen. Minutes later, the side door opened. A man in his late 70s shuffled in, gripping a metal walker with rubber tips. His posture was bent from years of carrying burdens, some physical, most invisible. He wore a faded jacket with a patch on the sleeve. U.S. Army, Vietnam era. His eyes scanned the room nervously until they landed on Evelyn. Then his shoulders relaxed, just slightly. "Mr. Briggs," the judge said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle, "thank you for coming in. Please have a seat." An extra chair was brought forward. As Mr. Briggs settled in, Evelyn stepped beside him, not too close, but near enough that he could see her if he needed to. A silent promise. "You're not alone." "Ms. Thorne," the judge continued, "before we go further, may I ask, when did you last appear in court?" She considered the question. "Officially? 10 years ago. I handled a few guardianship cases after that, mostly informal, helping neighbors or church members navigate paperwork. But I retired from active practice after my husband passed. He was my sounding board. Without him, the courtroom felt quieter. There was no self-pity in her words, just honesty. And in that honesty, the room seemed to lean in. But you kept your license active, the judge noted. I did, she said, because the law isn't just a profession. It's a responsibility. And sometimes responsibility doesn't retire. The words hung there, simple but profound. The young law student in the back, who'd skipped her afternoon class to observe real courtroom dynamics, quickly scribbled them down in her notebook. She didn't know it yet, but she'd quote that line years later in her own first closing argument. Judge Wexler exhaled slowly. He looked at the opposing counsel. Given the exhibits presented, and the lack of verified debt documentation from your side, I'm inclined to rule in favor of the plaintiff unless you can produce credible evidence of this lien within the next 10 minutes. The attorney stammered something about needing to consult his office, but it was clear the game was up. He knew, and everyone in the room knew, that the lien was built on sand. Evelyn didn't press. She didn't need to. She simply turned to Mr. Briggs and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's going to be all right," she said quietly so only he could hear. He nodded, his eyes glistening. "I knew it would be once you said you'd help." Outside, the rain had eased to a drizzle. Inside, something deeper than a legal ruling was taking place, a restoration. Not just of a home, but of trust, of dignity, of the idea that the law, at its best, protects the vulnerable, not the powerful. Later, as the judge formally dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled, the gallery didn't erupt in cheers. There was no applause, but there was a collective exhale, a quiet sense of rightness settling over the room like dust after a long wind. As people began to file out, the court reporter approached Evelyn. "I watched you argue the Henderson case in '83, she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You were the only one who believed those families deserved to stay in their homes." "You were right," Evelyn smiled faintly. "I just read the law same as today." "No," the reporter said. "You saw the people behind the paperwork." "That's different," Evelyn didn't argue. She just thanked her and turned to help Mr. Briggs gather his things. But the story didn't end there. Because word travels fast in courthouses and faster online. By that evening, a sketch drawn by a local artist who'd been sitting in the gallery made its way onto social media. It showed Evelyn standing at the counsel table, rain-streaked window behind her, bar card in hand, the judge looking up in stunned realization. The caption read, "When the legend walks back in." Overnight, messages poured in. Former clients, old colleagues, law students asking for advice. A local civil rights organization offered to cover her expenses if she'd take on similar cases. She declined most of them. But one message gave her pause, a note from the dean of the city's law school, asking if she'd consider speaking to a group of first-year students, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds. She almost said no. She wasn't looking for attention. But then she thought of the young woman in the gallery who'd taken notes like her life depended on it. She thought of all the times she'd walked into rooms where no one looked like her, sounded like her, or believed she belonged. And she remembered how one kind word, one open door had changed everything for her once. So she wrote back, "I'll come. But only if it's a conversation, not a lecture." Meanwhile, Judge Wexler sat in his chambers long after court adjourned. He reread the transcript of the day's hearing. He thought about his tone, his assumptions, the way he'd spoken to her before knowing who she was. It wasn't malice, he told himself that. But intent didn't erase impact. The next morning, he drafted a new courtroom policy. All self-represented parties or unfamiliar counsel would be addressed with neutral respect until their standing was confirmed. No more snap judgments, no more condescension disguised as efficiency. And then, on a plain sheet of courthouse letterhead, he wrote a note by hand. Not an official apology, those felt too formal, too distant. Just a few lines. "Thank you for reminding me what this bench is supposed to stand for. Judge Wexler." He slipped it into an envelope and left it with the clerk to deliver. Evelyn received it 2 days later. She read it once, then tucked it into her satchel, right next to her bar card. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even those in positions of authority can choose to grow. And sometimes all it takes is one quiet woman in a worn coat to show them the way. The courtroom didn't erupt in cheers. There were no dramatic gavels slamming, no swelling music, no slow-motion shots of justice served. Just the soft rustle of papers being gathered, the creak of wooden benches as people stood, and the quiet hum of a system that, for once, had worked the way it was supposed to. But what happened next wasn't about spectacle, it was about substance. And in that ordinary room with its scuffed floors and flickering fluorescent lights, something extraordinary unfolded, not in shouts, but in sentences. Evelyn didn't waste time basking in the judge's reversal or the gallery's silent awe. She turned her full attention to the matter at hand, dismantling the landlord's case with the precision of someone who'd spent decades learning how power hides behind paperwork. She knew better than anyone that injustice rarely announces itself with sirens. It slips in through fine print, buried clauses, and bureaucratic indifference. So she met it not with outrage, but with clarity. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady as a metronome, "Crestline Holdings claims a lien based on municipal improvement assessments from 2019. But according to the county assessor's office, no such assessments were ever levied on Mr. Briggs's property. In fact, the entire Maple Street block was excluded from that infrastructure project due to soil instability." She slid a printed email across the table, official letterhead, time-stamped, signed by the county tax director. The opposing counsel's eyes darted to it, then away, as if looking too long might burn him. "And even if such a debt existed," Evelyn continued, "state law requires that any lien be recorded in the public registry within 30 days of assessment. This so-called lien, filed last month, retroactively dated, without notice to the homeowner, without a hearing, without even a courtesy call." She paused, not for effect, but to let the weight settle. "That's not just sloppy. It's predatory." The judge didn't interrupt. He leaned forward, elbows on the bench, fingers steepled. He'd heard variations of this before. Companies buying bundles of dubious debt, sending threatening letters, banking on fear to extract payments from people who couldn't afford lawyers. But he'd never seen it unraveled so cleanly, so calmly by someone who treated the law not as a weapon but as a tool for repair. "Counsel?" the judge asked, turning to the opposing attorney. The man stood, tugging at his collar. "Your Honor, we relied on documentation provided by our vendor. We had no reason to believe it was inaccurate." "Did you verify it?" Evelyn asked, not turning to face him but keeping her gaze on the judge. A subtle but powerful move. She wasn't engaging in a duel. She was presenting facts to the court. We assumed the vendor had done due diligence," he stammered. "Assumed," Evelyn repeated softly, while a disabled veteran faced losing his home, the only home he's owned since returning from war, because your firm sent a letter demanding $47,000 you couldn't prove was owed. The gallery was utterly still. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. Then Evelyn did something unexpected. She reached into her satchel again and pulled out a second folder, thicker this time. "Your Honor, I've also compiled records from 3 other properties in the same neighborhood that received identical notices from Crestline Holdings over the past 6 months. All owned by elderly residents, all with clean tax records, all threatened with seizure." She handed the documents to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. As he flipped through them, his expression hardened. This wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a pattern. A strategy. "Ms. Thorne," he said slowly, "are you suggesting this is part of a broader scheme?" "I'm not suggesting, Your Honor," she replied. "I'm showing," and that was the difference. She wasn't speculating. She wasn't emoting. She'd done the work, the quiet, unglamorous work of calling clerks, requesting records, cross-referencing dates, and connecting dots that others had ignored. While the flashy firms chased headlines, she'd been in the archives, in the county offices, in the living rooms of scared neighbors, listening. The opposing counsel tried to object, to claim hearsay, to argue relevance, but his heart wasn't in it. He knew the game was over. His client hadn't just lost a case. They'd been exposed. Judge Wexler didn't need to deliberate long. Given the complete lack of verified debt, the retroactive filing, and the pattern of similar actions targeting vulnerable homeowners, he said, his voice firm, "I find that Crestline Holdings acted in bad faith. The lien is void. The case is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the State Attorney General's Office for investigation into potential violations of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. A quiet ripple went through the room. This wasn't just a win. It was a warning shot across an entire industry. But Evelyn's focus never wavered from Mr. Briggs. As the judge issued his ruling, she placed a gentle hand on the old man's arm. "You're safe now," she whispered. "They can't touch your home." He didn't say anything. Just nodded, his eyes wet, his grip tightening on his walker. For him, this wasn't about legal precedent or corporate accountability. It was about sleeping in his own bed tonight, about tending to the rosebush his wife had planted decades ago, about knowing that after everything he'd given, he wouldn't be thrown out like trash. After court adjourned, people lingered, not to gawk but to bear witness. The young law student approached Evelyn, notebook in hand, voice trembling slightly. "Ma'am, how did you know where to look? How did you find all that?" Evelyn smiled, not with pride but with warmth. "I started by listening to Mr. Briggs. He told me the notice came out of nowhere. So I asked, who benefits? Then I followed the paper trail. The law leaves footprints if you're willing to look." The student nodded, scribbling furiously. "I want to do that kind of work someday." "Then learn to listen first," Evelyn said. "The law is just words on a page. People give it meaning." Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off puddles on the courthouse steps. Reporters had gathered, tipped off by someone in the clerk's office. Cameras clicked as Evelyn helped Mr. Briggs down the steps, shielding him from the sudden attention. "Miss Thorne," a reporter called. "Can you comment on your surprise return to court?" She paused but didn't turn. "I didn't return," she said simply. "I was never gone. I've just been working where the cameras don't go." And with that, she guided Mr. Briggs to his old sedan, its paint chipped but engine purring faithfully. She opened the passenger door for him, waited until he was settled, then closed it gently. As she walked back toward the bus stop, a man in a suit approached, older, silver-haired, carrying a briefcase that looked as worn as her satchel. "Evelyn," he said, voice thick with emotion. She turned. Recognition flickered in her eyes. "Arthur, I thought you retired to Florida." "Tried to," he laughed, "but I saw the sketch online. Knew it had to be you." He shook his head. "You haven't lost a step." "I just remembered what matters," she said. They stood in silence for a moment, two old warriors who'd fought battles no one saw, in courtrooms no one filmed. Then Arthur reached into his pocket and handed her a small card. "The Legal Aid Coalition is hosting a symposium next month. They asked me to find you. Said they need your voice." She almost refused. But then she thought of the student, of Mr. Briggs, of all the people who'd been told their stories didn't count. "All right," she said finally. "But only if they promise no podiums. Just chairs in a circle," he grinned. "Done." Back home that evening, Evelyn sat on her porch with a cup of chamomile tea, watching fireflies blink in the dusk. Her neighbor's house, Mr. Briggs's house, had a light on in the kitchen. A small, steady glow. She thought about how justice isn't always grand. Sometimes it's just a light left on for someone who thought they'd be left in the dark. The next morning, a thick envelope arrived at her door. Inside were copies of the judge's formal order, along with a handwritten note from the county clerk. "Thank you for reminding us why we keep these records." She pinned it to her kitchen bulletin board, next to grocery lists and church bulletins. News of the case spread, not through viral outrage but through word of mouth. At barbershops, in church basements, over backyard fences, people began asking, "Did you hear about the lawyer who shut down that scam?" And slowly others started coming forward. People who'd received similar letters, who'd paid out of fear, who'd stayed silent because they thought no one would believe them. Evelyn didn't take on all their cases. She couldn't. But she held a free clinic at the community center every other Saturday. No appointments, no forms. Just show up, tell your story, and she'd help you figure out your next step. One woman brought her teenage grandson, who'd been suspended from school over a minor incident that escalated due to biased reporting. Evelyn didn't file a lawsuit. She sat with the principal, pointed to the district's own anti-discrimination policy, and asked, "Does this still mean something, or is it just wallpaper?" The boy was reinstated the next day. Another man came with eviction papers. She discovered his landlord had never registered the rental unit, making the lease void. He stayed. She never charged a dime. Never saw credit. But something shifted in the neighborhood. People stood a little taller. They asked more questions. They stopped signing things they didn't understand. And in a quiet corner of the city, in a courtroom that had once dismissed her before she'd even spoken, a judge began starting each session with a new phrase. Before we proceed, does anyone here need help understanding their rights? It wasn't revolution. It was repair. Slow, steady, human. And Evelyn Thorne, sipping tea on her porch, watching her neighbor water his roses, knew that was enough. More than enough. Because real justice isn't measured in headlines. It's measured in homes kept and dignity restored, in the quiet certainty that someone saw you, believed you, and stood with you when it mattered most. The story didn't end when the gavel fell. In fact, that was only the beginning of something much quieter, much deeper. Something that spread not through headlines but through hallways, phone calls, and front porch conversations. Within days, the sketch from the courtroom had been shared thousands of times online. Not with outrage, but with reverence. People weren't just talking about the case, they were talking about the woman who'd stood in that room with nothing but a worn satchel and a lifetime of knowing how to listen. And slowly, the ripples began to reach shores she never expected. One morning, a thick envelope arrived at Evelyn's mailbox. It was from the city's law school, sealed with official insignia. Inside was an invitation, not to accept an award or give a keynote, but to host a small seminar for first-year students, particularly those from backgrounds underrepresented in the legal profession. The letter was humble, almost shy in its wording. We don't need a lecture. We need your presence. If you're willing, she almost tossed it aside. She wasn't looking to return to the spotlight. But then she remembered the young woman in the gallery, the one scribbling notes like her future depended on it. She remembered how, decades ago, a retired judge had once invited her to sit in on a closed-door hearing, just so she could see how arguments unfolded behind the scenes. That small act had given her the courage to walk into her first courtroom alone, so she wrote back, "I'll come," but no stage, just chairs and coffee. The day of the seminar, she arrived early wearing the same navy coat from court, though this time paired with a soft cardigan and sensible shoes. The room was modest, a seminar space tucked away in the back of the law library, far from the grand lecture halls where famous professors held court. About 20 students waited, some nervous, some curious, all watching her with a mix of awe and uncertainty. None of them knew quite what to expect. She didn't begin with her resume. She didn't list her cases or her victories. Instead, she sat in one of the circle of chairs and said, "Tell me why you came here." At first, silence. Then a young man with tired eyes spoke up. "I grew up in a neighborhood where people didn't trust lawyers. They said the system was rigged. But I saw how my cousin got railroaded because he couldn't afford a real defense. I want to change that." A woman with braids and a quiet voice added, "My grandmother was scammed out of her home by a contractor who forged her signature. No one believed her because she didn't speak perfect English. I want to be the kind of lawyer who listens before they file." One by one they shared, not polished statements but raw, honest reasons. Evelyn listened, truly listened, nodding not to agree but to acknowledge. When it was her turn, she didn't offer solutions. She offered perspective. "I spent 40 years in courtrooms," she said, "and the most powerful thing I ever learned wasn't in a law book. It was this. Justice doesn't live in the rulings. It lives in the questions you ask before you even walk through the door. Who's being left out? Whose story hasn't been heard? What's the human cost behind the legal jargon?" She told them about Mr. Briggs not as a case, but as a man who watered his wife's roses every Sunday, who still saluted the flag when it passed in parades, who cried when he thought no one was looking because he was afraid of being a burden. "The law didn't save his home," she said gently. "We did, by showing up, by caring enough to check the records, by refusing to let fear do the talking." The students leaned in. This wasn't the legal education they'd expected. No Latin terms, no hypotheticals about runaway trolleys. This was about heart, about responsibility, about the quiet courage it takes to stand with someone when the world has already decided they don't matter. After the session, several students lingered. One asked if she'd consider mentoring. She hesitated, then said, "I don't do formal mentoring, but if you ever have a question, or you're working on a case that keeps you up at night, you can knock on my door. Just don't expect fancy answers. I mostly serve tea and ask more questions." Meanwhile, something else was shifting inside the courthouse itself. Judge Wexler, still unsettled by his own assumptions, began reviewing every interaction he'd had over the past year. He pulled transcripts. He spoke with bailiffs and clerks. He asked quietly if others had felt dismissed, talked over, or judged before being heard. The answers weren't always comfortable, but they were honest. Within a month, he implemented a new protocol. All individuals appearing without obvious legal representation would be greeted with a simple question: "Would you like help understanding your rights today?" Before any proceedings began, he also mandated implicit bias training for all courtroom staff, not as punishment but as practice. And in his chambers, he kept a framed copy of the State Bar's early attorney list with Evelyn's name circled in pencil. A reminder, he also did something few judges ever do. He wrote a personal letter, not on courthouse stationery but on plain paper in his own handwriting. It wasn't long, just a few lines. "You didn't just win a case that day. You reminded me why I took this oath in the first place. Thank you for your grace even when I didn't deserve it." He slipped it into an envelope and left it with the clerk, asking that it be delivered quietly without fanfare. Evelyn found it tucked into her mailbox one evening, along with a utility bill and a flyer for a neighborhood cleanup. She read it twice, then placed it in her satchel, next to the judge's earlier note and her bar card, not as trophies but as markers, proof that people can change even in places where change moves slowly. Back in the community, the impact deepened. Word got around that Evelyn was holding informal legal clinics at the community center. No appointments, no paperwork. Just show up, tell your story, and she'd help you figure out your next step. At first, only a few came, mostly older folks who'd been burned before. But soon others followed. A single mother facing an unfair eviction, a small business owner tangled in licensing red tape, a teenager accused of vandalism based on shaky witness testimony. Evelyn never took every case. She knew her limits, but she always listened. And more often than not, she found a way forward, not with dramatic courtroom showdowns, but with phone calls, letters, and calm conversations that reminded people in power that real humans were on the other side of their decisions. One Saturday, a young woman arrived with her grandmother, the same woman who'd been scammed years ago. The granddaughter, now in law school herself, had tracked down the contractor through public records and wanted to file a civil suit. Evelyn reviewed the files, nodded slowly, then said, "You've done the hard part, finding the truth. Now let's make sure the system sees it too." They spent the afternoon drafting a demand letter, citing consumer protection laws and precedents Evelyn remembered from the 1990s. The contractor settled within a week, returning the money with interest. The grandmother cried, not from sadness but from relief. "I thought no one would ever believe me," she whispered. "That's why we do this," Evelyn replied, "so people don't have to prove they deserve to be heard." The story of the courtroom encounter kept echoing in unexpected places. A local theater group reached out, asking if they could adapt the events into a short play for community outreach. Evelyn said no to dramatization, but yes to a panel discussion, justice in plain sight, where real people could share their experiences with housing, debt, and dignity. Even the media began to shift its tone. Instead of framing it as elderly woman shocks judge, local news outlets started running segments on predatory property liens, interviewing housing advocates and retired attorneys who'd seen this pattern for years. One reporter even tracked down 3 other seniors who'd paid thousands to Crestlane Holdings out of fear and helped them file claims for restitution. None of it was flashy. None of it went viral in the way modern attention demands, but it stuck. It mattered. And through it all, Evelyn remained steady, never seeking credit, never positioning herself as a hero. She'd seen too many movements derailed by ego. To her, this wasn't about her. It was about making space for others to step into their power. One evening, as she sat on her porch shelling peas, Mr. Briggs wheeled over in his walker, holding a small pot of marigolds. "Planted these for you," he said. "Your wife loved them, didn't she?" Evelyn's breath caught. Her husband had planted marigolds every spring, saying they were stubborn enough to bloom anywhere. She hadn't grown them since he passed. "She did," Evelyn said softly. "Thank you." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the rooftops. Fireflies blinked in the gathering dusk. Somewhere down the street, children laughed. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary neighborhood, but it felt sacred. Because what had begun as a single act of quiet courage, a woman walking into a courtroom to defend her neighbor, had sparked something that couldn't be undone. Not just policy changes or legal wins, but a renewed belief that the law at its best belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford it, not just those who look the part, but anyone who shows up with truth in their hands and care in their heart. And Evelyn Thorne, sipping iced tea on her porch with marigolds at her feet, knew that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply refuse to let someone be erased. The days grew longer as summer settled in, wrapping the neighborhood in a soft, golden light that made even the cracked sidewalks look warm. Evelyn's porch became a quiet hub, not by design but by habit. Neighbors stopped by with garden tomatoes, borrowed tools, or just to sit for a few minutes in the stillness she seemed to carry with her. She never made a show of it. There were no banners, no announcements, no social media posts. But people knew, if you needed someone to listen, really listen, her screen door was always open. Mr. Briggs had repainted his front steps a deep forest green, the same shade his wife had chosen decades ago. He'd even started tending the flower bed again, his hands moving slowly but surely through the soil. Every Sunday morning, without fail, he'd water the marigolds Evelyn now kept in a clay pot by her railing. They bloomed bright and bold, as if determined to prove that beauty could grow even after long winters. One afternoon, as Evelyn sorted through a stack of mail, mostly junk, a few handwritten notes from former clients, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something in her gut told her to answer. On the other end was a young woman's voice, steady but nervous. "Ms. Thorne, my name is Keisha. My grandmother. She was one of your clients back in 1978. The housing discrimination case in Eastside." Evelyn paused. She remembered. A row of families, mostly Black and Latino, had been denied home loans by the same bank despite perfect credit. The bank claimed it was risk assessment. Evelyn had called it what it was, redlining. She'd taken depositions, subpoenaed internal memos, and stood in a packed courtroom as the judge ordered the bank to approve every denied application and pay damages. It wasn't just a legal win. It was a crack in a wall that had stood for generations. "I remember your grandmother," Evelyn said softly. "She brought me sweet potato pie after the ruling." Keisha laughed, a sound full of relief. "She still talks about you. Says you were the first person who made her feel like the law saw her as a person, not a problem." There was a pause. Then Keisha took a breath. "I just passed the bar last month. I start at a public defender's office next week, and I was wondering, if it's not too much to ask, could I spend a day with you? Just watch how you work? I know you don't take cases anymore, but I'd learn more from you in one afternoon than in 3 years of law school." Evelyn didn't answer right away. She looked out at the street, the kids riding bikes, the mailman waving as he passed, Mr. Briggs humming as he deadheaded his roses. She thought about all the doors that had been closed to her when she started, all the people who'd said she didn't belong in courtrooms, in law firms, in history books, and she thought about the young woman on the phone, standing at the edge of her own journey, asking not for a shortcut, but for a glimpse of what real justice looks like up close. "All right," Evelyn said finally. "Come by Thursday. Bring your questions. And wear comfortable shoes. We might walk over to the county clerk's office." Keisha's voice brightened. "Thank you. I won't take much of your time." "You're not taking time," Evelyn replied. "You're continuing something." Thursday morning arrived clear and warm. Keisha showed up at 8 sharp, dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, carrying a notebook and a reusable coffee cup. She looked young, so young, but her eyes held a seriousness that reminded Evelyn of herself at that age. Eager, yes, but also aware of the weight she was about to carry. They didn't start in a courtroom. They started at the public library in the microfilm room, where Evelyn showed her how to trace property records from the 1950s, how to spot patterns of exclusion hidden in dry, bureaucratic language. "The truth is often in what's missing," Evelyn explained, pointing to a page where entire blocks were labeled undesirable with no further explanation. They didn't need to say why. Everyone knew. Then they walked to the courthouse, not through the front entrance, but around back where the maintenance staff kept a spare key for Evelyn after the elevator incident. Inside, she introduced Keisha to the clerk who'd worked there for 30 years, the bailiff who remembered every case, the court reporter who still used shorthand. These are the people who keep justice running, Evelyn said. Lawyers come and go, but they're the steady hands. They sat in an empty courtroom for a while, just listening to the building breathe, the creak of floorboards, the distant hum of the HVAC system, the echo of footsteps in the hall. This place isn't magic, Evelyn said. It's just wood and stone. What makes it matter is who walks through the door and why. Later, over lunch at a diner down the street, Keisha asked the question she'd been holding on to. How do you keep going when it feels like nothing changes? When the same injustices keep happening, just in new packaging. Evelyn stirred her iced tea, the clink of the spoon soft against the glass. I don't measure change in headlines, she said. I measure it in moments. Like Mr. Briggs sleeping in his own bed. Like your grandmother buying her first home without fear. Like you walking into that public defender's office next week, ready to fight for someone no one else believes in. She looked at Keisha, really looked at her. You won't fix the whole system. None of us will. But you can be the person who shows up when it matters. That's enough. It's always been enough. Keisha nodded, her eyes glistening but dry. She didn't cry. She absorbed. And Evelyn knew this was how it continued. Not through monuments or awards, but through quiet handoffs one generation to the next. As the weeks passed, Evelyn didn't return to full-time practice. But she didn't retreat either. She agreed to consult on a few civil rights cases brought by local nonprofits. She reviewed briefs for young attorneys who emailed her late at night, unsure of their arguments. She even let a documentary crew film a short piece not about her, but about community-based legal advocacy, on the condition that Mr. Briggs and others got to tell their own stories. The judge, meanwhile, kept his promise. The courthouse elevator was fixed within a week. He also started holding monthly community listening sessions, where residents could voice concerns about the legal system without fear of judgment. Attendance was low at first, but it grew. People began to trust that someone was actually listening. One evening, as Evelyn sat on her porch shelling peas again, some habits never change, she received a package. No return address, just her name in neat handwriting. Inside was a framed photograph. The courtroom sketch from that rainy Tuesday, but with a small addition in the corner, a hand-drawn marigold blooming beside the bench. Tucked behind the frame was a note from the artist. You reminded us that justice has a face. Thank you for letting us see it. She hung it in her hallway, next to a photo of her husband and a faded program from her first court appearance. Time moved on, as it always does. Leaves turned, then fell. Winter came and went. And through it all, Evelyn remained, not as a legend frozen in a moment, but as a living presence steady and sure. The real legacy wasn't in the rulings or the reforms, though those mattered. It was in the small, unrecorded moments. The teenager who kept his record clean because someone believed in him. The widow who kept her home because a neighbor refused to look away. The young lawyer who walked into her first courtroom with a little less fear because she'd spent an afternoon watching Evelyn Thorne do what she did best. Listen. Prepare and stand firm. One spring morning, Evelyn woke to the sound of birds and the smell of rain-washed earth. She made tea, stepped onto the porch, and saw Keisha walking up the sidewalk, now in her second year as a public defender. She wasn't alone. Beside her was a teenage client, a boy with anxious eyes and a worn backpack, who'd been accused of shoplifting but insisted he'd been wrongly identified. Mind if we sit with you for a bit? Keisha asked gently. Evelyn smiled. Pull up a chair. They talked, not about legal strategy, not yet, but about the boys' school, his younger sister, the job he'd just started at a bike shop. Evelyn asked questions, listened, nodded. And in that ordinary moment, on an ordinary porch, the circle closed. Because justice isn't a monument. It's a practice. A choice made again and again by ordinary people who refuse to let dignity be erased. And sometimes, it begins with a woman in a worn coat walking into a courtroom, ready not to shock but to serve. Years from now, no one will remember the exact words spoken in courtroom 3 that rainy Tuesday. But they'll remember how it felt to be seen, to be believed, to know that someone somewhere was willing to stand in the gap, and that more than anything is how change takes root, not with a roar, but with a whisper. Not with a spotlight, but with a hand held out in the dark. Evelyn Thorne never sought to be remembered. But she will be, Not for the cases she won, but for the doors she held open, the voices she amplified, and the quiet certainty that justice, at its heart, is human. And as long as there are people willing to show up with care, with courage, and with a worn satchel full of hope, it always will be.